Welcome to the STEM Talk podcast, your 30-minute monthly STEM pulse check. Hosted by the Afterschool STEM Hub, STEM Education Coalition, and STEM Ecosystems by TIES. The STEM Talk podcast creates a safe space for dialogue while maintaining a focus on information that matters to you and the communities you serve. In just 30 minutes each month, join our experts from across the STEM landscape as they provide factual information, practical strategies, and actionable resources to help you navigate the ever-changing world of STEM education, workforce development, policy, and advocacy. Welcome to STEM Talk Episode 5, Advocacy Works, where we explore the issues, innovations, and ideas shaping STEM learning and workforce. Hi, my name is Jenny Frank, and I am the Director of the STEM Ecosystem Initiative here at TIES. Today, we're diving into a topic that affects every STEM program and educator across the country. We're talking about advocacy that actually works. Over the past month, we've witnessed something remarkable: coordinated advocacy efforts that successfully influence federal education funding decisions. But how did it happen? What strategies proved most effective? And what can the STEM community learn to build on these successes? Today, we're going behind the scenes with our experts who were directly involved in these efforts. They'll share the real strategies, the lessons learned, and the roadmap for sustainable advocacy that protects and advances STEM education. So let's welcome back our guest experts. First, we have Dr. Anita Krishnamurthi, who is the Senior Vice President for STEM and Youth Engagement at the Afterschool Alliance. Next, we have Della Cronin, Principal at Bose Public Affairs Group, and James Brown, Executive Director of the STEM Education Coalition. Hello, everybody. Welcome to the STEM Talk. Let's get started.
Thanks so much, Jenny. And I'm going to share some slides here. Hope everybody can see this okay. So, hi, everyone. So glad that you're here with us today. As we all know, there are many funding streams that are under threat and lots of advocacy efforts and advocates fighting for issues and funds that we all really care very, very deeply about. So what I'm going to do today is focus on what the Afterschool Alliance did and continues to do to advocate for the 21st Century Community Learning Centers program, the only dedicated federal funding stream for after-school and summer programs. Now, more than 90% of the 21st Century programs offer STEM learning opportunities. So it's a really key funding stream for after-school STEM and hence relevant for this conversation, which is why I'm focusing on it. And I want to acknowledge up front that this is one story about the fight to save this one funding stream. But our hope is that it really serves as an example and a case study for effective advocacy. And what I hope you'll take away after our conversation today is that advocacy really does work. Lawmakers still do listen to their constituents when you make a strong case for funding. And also the importance of the need to play the long game and have a systematic and a sustained engagement campaign through both good times and lean times. The relationships that are built in the good times are what allow you to ask for things in the lean times. So what you see here now is a timeline since the election last year. We had every expectation that 21st Century would need protection as President Trump had zeroed out this funding stream in every budget request that he had proposed in his previous first term. And the Alliance had been successful in not only fighting for that, but bringing it back with an increase. So that's what we were preparing for. And what I want to draw your attention to here is when the budget request was released at the end of May, the speed at which we reacted to the budget request, because we had been preparing and forecasting this for a while. We didn't get started with the advocacy only after we saw the president's budget request. And again, it was possible because we've had a grassroots and a grass tops strategy for a long time, for several decades, in fact. And so we had a website that was ready to go. We'd already activated the field to start contacting Congress and their lawmakers about the importance of the funding stream. But what we weren't really sort of what did catch us by surprise a little bit was the withholding of the funds that was announced in June. As you may recall, the bipartisan FY 2025 spending bill was signed into law in mid-March in this year. And typically, the state education agencies receive the allocation tables in the spring. And these funds are normally used to cover summer 2025 programs, as well as the 25-26 school year. But by June, 6 programs still had not received their allocation estimates, which totaled to about $6.8 billion. This was Title 1C, Title 2A, Title 3A, Title 4A, as well as Title 4B, which is the 21st Century Community Learning Centers grants and the Adult Education State grants. So we were beginning to feel a little concerned already that the funds might be withheld, and that proved to be true. On June 30th, the memo to the SEAs came indicating that those funds would not be available to draw down come July 1st, pending an ongoing sort of programmatic review. There was no timeline given for that. And remember that the FY25 CR had already passed in March of that year. But because we had an active campaign already around the FY26 President's budget request, we were able to pivot very quickly to a new campaign that was now focused on getting the FY25 dollars released. And this was the launch of the Release the Funds campaign. And what you see on the screen here again is a number of activities that occurred in July. And the uproar and the advocacy really were fierce. Now, this was about parents losing immediate access to summer programs and after-school programs in the fall. So it was a very urgent issue that people were starting to feel immediately. And because we have collected a set of supportive champions in Congress over many years and continue to do that with the new Congress, we saw both Republicans and Democrats fighting for this funding. And it was especially really good to see the Republicans speak up about releasing these funds. And here again, I just want to take a moment to emphasize the importance of the grassroots engagement and advocacy. Now, advocacy groups like the Afterschool Alliance and the STEM Education Coalition do the grass tops work every day, day in and day out. But we need partners like you in the field who are able to step up and show the impact of the cuts on lawmakers, communities, and constituents. We were able to get a ton of press coverage at both the national and local levels, where newspapers and television programs were featuring this. We had spots that our executive director spoke on MSNBC, on PBS, NewsHour, in the New York Times, and a lot of local news coverage also happened. And all of that combined advocacy worked. We can't really point to one thing and say that it was this one singular action that did it. It was a combination of the advocacy from groups like ours and people and programs in the field like you all, and the press coverage and the support in Congress that turned the ship around. And as soon as the funds were released, we had a thank you message that was ready to go on the same website, where we were asking people to follow the action alert and contact Congress. And that is still live on our website, because it's really hugely important to thank Congress for action and follow through when they've done what we've asked them to do. So some lessons to share, right? Like, after school has long had strong bipartisan support among policymakers and voters. And much of this support can really be attributed to the 2 decades plus of the work that the Afterschool Alliance has been doing, along with partners and allies in the field and programs like you all, developing stories, messages, the research, supporting messengers, the relationship building, and information sharing. And also, we've just been relentlessly bipartisan in all of this time. And, having data and stories in hand is really important, and leaning in on the power of the work and using plain, positive, resonant language, having stories of impact and the data and outcomes is all key. And showing rather than talking about it is really, really important. there's no better way to showcase the power and the value of the programs than having people come in and see it firsthand. So, for example, the Afterschool Alliance has been running a Lights On After School campaign, and this is 2025 is our 26th year of doing it. We have 1 million people who at more than 8,000 events that go into after-school programs and see what it's like, and that includes lawmakers, parents, community leaders, the media. So invite parents, media, your congressional reps and their staff to come visit your program. And we have toolkits on our website that can really help you with each step of this process, from preparing and planning a site visit to drafting invitations to following up after a great visit. And thank members for support just as much as you ask them for help when needed. And tips for a strong social media presence. As you all know where your audience is, use authentic stories and use strong visuals. Take photos of kids in action in your programs. Have the stories and the data that's ready to go. And for STEM in particular, the Afterschool STEM Hub, which is a partner on the STEM Talk series, is the Afterschool STEM Advocacy Initiative at the Afterschool Alliance. We have a lot of tools and resources on our website, and we're always adding more, ranging from talking points to photos and videos and opportunities to provide input on legislation and policy, and responding to action alerts, as well as the action alerts that James and his team put out on the STEM Education Coalition's website. So I'm going to end there and leave you with a link to our website. And we're also on LinkedIn, where you can follow us and get the latest information. And I will stop sharing my screen and turn it over to James and Della now to pick up on this and say a little bit about the applicability of some of this and some of the differences that might apply to the broader STEM education advocacy work, which is different from maybe after school, which has a very specific funding stream.
Thanks so much for that overview, Anita. Having been in the thick of it with you and everyone at the Alliance, it was certainly something to see, something to experience, and in what seems like we're being asked to call members of Congress and use our voices so often. Recently, it was gratifying to see a result this time. And I would just like to point out that while the release of the 21st Century Community Learning Centers funds came before the release of the other title funds. And I remember when working with other groups, STEM is a issue that touches all those program funds that were withheld. The teacher groups were certainly very concerned that Title II funds were being withheld. Professional development, particularly in STEM disciplines, is crucial to their ability to give students the knowledge they need to be successful in the 21st century. And so, the 21st century funds had this advantage over some of the others in that programs were going to close quite imminently. Parents' lives were going to change if those funds weren't released. The other programmatic funds sort of didn't enjoy that immediate, visible result for communities and families and schools. And I think that the success of the after-school voice then bled into these other programs that perhaps were fighting a more uphill battle. And so I just am making the point that advocacy and its success can be contagious and can bleed into other areas. And while other stakeholders in those programs work just as hard as the Alliance, it perhaps was their success that buoyed the success of the other events. I also would point out that advocacy, we're making the point today that advocacy works. All of us have received multiple calls from various issues that are important to us professionally and personally to take action. And I think that the fact that there was a beneficial result here is one that we can carry into subsequent advocacy efforts on the Hill.
I think, the challenge we have in the STEM community that's different from the after-school community is, this is the showcase funding stream for the after-school community. That's part of the reason why the Afterschool Alliance exists. So they have a very clear mission of focusing on this program. But the lesson to be learned from that is because there are many different STEM related funding streams at the federal government that run through NSF and research agencies, the Department of Education, and other things, it reinforces the point you made a moment ago, which is I feel like before COVID and before so much digital sort of overload happened, most professional organizations had a regular stream of advocacy messages. They had fly-ins to Washington, D.C. Their advocacy muscles were a little more flexed in the era where people were still sending letters and doing things, quote, the old-fashioned way. And in the age of social media, one of the things that has happened is most of the STEM community is starting to do this advocacy again. I mean, if you look at the STEM Ed Coalition's website, we have an action center that went up earlier this year. We've seen the uptick in activity in the same timeline around these funds being frozen. And I think what we have to do as a STEM community is learn from this successful example and get more people telling their peers about what they did as an advocate and asking, okay, what are we which action alerts are we tracking this month? Which ones are we tracking this year? Which ones apply to our local school districts? Whose job is it in our organization to be looking at these things and following them? Who's going to send it out to our members when it's time to send it out to our members? Because in the same way that you can see the participation in this podcast grow now that we're on episode 4, I think it is, we want to see the response to action alerts grow in the larger education community, the STEM community writ large. And we can start to see that. This is an example of that behavior in action, but it means that every single organization that's represented here has to have that conversation in their own organizations about what are we going to do to join in advocacy? Are we going to conferences to do it? Are we participating in things like this? Have we sent out calls to action for our members? Have we decided which federal programs matter enough to us to send out those action alerts so that before these things happen, you're ready to go when they happen? And that's one of the challenges. One of the challenges in the scientific community is that the science community evaluates these things in a scholarly and circumspect manner, and sometimes that takes longer than the window of opportunity, right? If it takes you a month to decide whether to send out an action alert, sometimes the action is already passed, right? So one of the things that we have to do is figure out in advance, as sort of circumspect organizations, which things matter to us that we can act on. So this is a really good example of thinking ahead, and seeing where we think there are vulnerabilities. We're going through the same exercise with NSF right now, where NSF's programs are under long-term challenge. We're going to see action on appropriations bills. This success that Anita outlined reminds me of something that happened in the STEM community about a dozen years ago when the House Republicans wanted to eliminate the requirement to test science under the No Child Left Behind law and what eventually became the Every Student Succeeds Act. That touched the same kind of nerve where science educators, people connected back to science, could say, well, that's going to affect me directly. And we got the same kind of media attention. And that turned around that public policy. But that's, a dozen years ago. This is our present example where people need to see this as a success and figure out, okay, how are we going to be ready next time around so that we are when this comes around again? So I saw a bunch of questions in the chat.
Yeah, there's also some questions in the Q&A that I would really love our experts here to talk about. Here's one from Andrea. Can you speak to overlap in messaging from the 21st Century CCLC specific advocacy campaigns and how it might be applied to other government agencies and how they prioritize STEM ed in their budgets, NASA, STEM ed, NIH, etc.?
So I'll take that one. Here's an example, right? If you go to the Action Center for the STEM Ed Coalition right now, you'll find something on the Department of Ed, something on the National Science Foundation, something on this funding pause, and several other things going back to the beginning of the year. What we're trying to do as more people get on board with this and we see the numbers go up is have an opportunity for people to engage where they're interested, right? If you have a grant from NASA, you're going to respond to the things for NASA first before you engage in other things. So we're gradually trying to populate that out so people can see what interests them. But you also have to follow the news about what's happening in the adjacent spaces too, because if somebody succeeds, when a governor is trying to reduce funding for something they don't consider to be a priority, and they propose something and nobody responds or not enough people respond, that only encourages that executive to go further down that road, right? So responding when you see allied people in trouble too is part of the engaging in the education community writ large and things that are STEM related, not just the one thing that you might care about yourself.
And if I can add to that, James, I think part of it is also being aware of which funding streams are actually funding the programs that are occurring, right? Like, because it comes from a large federal agency, and often some of these title grants then go to states and then eventually down to a local program. Sometimes programs don't even know that there's a federal agency funding stream that is the reason they're able to offer something. So being educated yourself and educating the programs that you might be working with is important, so they understand the ramifications when these kinds of consolidations and eliminations are proposed. And the other thing, I'll go back to what I said about showing, right? And having people come in, if you have an NSF funded program or a NASA funded program, making sure that your local lawmakers, as well as your federal lawmakers, come in and see what you are able to do for the kids in their community with that funding is really, really important, because it's it makes it personal. It helps to really showcase what is going away when that funding stream is cut, because otherwise it's very abstract and it's very theoretical. And that's a thing we should be just doing day in and day out, not just when a cut is proposed.
Mm-hmm. I would agree with you, Anita. I mean, it was surprising to me as we were all doing our advocacy work in the early days of the withholding, how uninformed even staff who work for members of Congress were about these programs and what they were doing in local communities. I would give folks the benefit of the doubt and chalk it up to newness in the role and the other things that can affect awareness on that front. But I agree wholeheartedly that just basic knowledge of knowing where federal dollars are going in your community is powerful, because folks can say, I don't think the federal government should be doing X, Y, Z, not knowing that they're sending their own kids to a program that's getting federal funds, or that federal funds are important to their daily life in a way that they were unaware. I agree wholeheartedly.
Well, and to that end, Della, like that's part of the reason why we started this podcast, was to speak to the broadest general audience about what's going on in the field at the intersection of STEM and after school and informal and career education, and try and make sure more people are informed, right? I mean, that's the first, this all starts with just knowing what's going on. And in this environment, it can be difficult to keep up when you've got all these different things happening on different fronts, but it starts with basic knowledge of what's going on. I wanted to come back, Jenny, to one of the questions in the Q&A, which was, are there actions that you have found that do not work or detrimental to
That was the one. Yeah, I think this is a really interesting aspect in building your skill level as and capacity for advocacy. There are certainly things that do not work and have been found over and over again to actually have a very opposite, or even in some cases, a detrimental effect.
I mean, I'll go back to something you said, Anita, which I think is really important. It requires a lot of patience to stay adroitly bipartisan in the education world, right? I mean, you see governments change, you see priorities go up and down. If you really do care about enduring priorities, then you also have to figure out how to endure the changes in partisanship and figure out how to work with both sides. Because if the issue you're working on is seen as a one-party issue, you're limiting your support, especially when that party is out of power. And so I think one of the big challenges here is trying to stay respectful. One of my mentors in this business says we can disagree, but without being disagreeable, right? And I think that is a really important part of this. Make your communications respectful, articulate your arguments in human terms. Don't assume the other people are doing things for reasons, that you don't understand maybe or don't share. Like, always trying to be very fact-based and very cordial in these communications. And, another thing that Anita highlighted, and this really does matter, the thank you message when somebody does something you want, right? That's showing gratitude. It's showing understanding of the fact that they had to do some work to advance the cause, and that it didn't come at no cost for them. And it's also showing that you're following the issue more than just a one click away kind of dynamic, right? It shows you really do care. The thank you, in this town, and Anita talked about some of the grass top sorts of things. We're getting ready to move our offices to another place, and I went through my files today, and I still have a file I started like 20 years ago with all the thank you letters I got from people who said, hey, thank you for doing something. Like, that's the one part I kept. Everything else went in the trash. But my point is just like, that's what people remember, in political jobs, is the people who followed up and sent them a thank you, because very few people do those kinds of things. So how you do it and how you make people feel doing it is just as important as doing it sometimes.
And sorry, Anita. I just wanted to, I know we're running short on time, and I wanted to extrapolate sort of this good news to additional good news in the spirit of success being contagious. There were some folks who spoke in favor of after school and other funds that had been withheld, who I think the STEM education community can count as allies on other counts. And to wit, before Congress left town, this is my way to sneak in a legislative update, there was some good news to report on both on funding bills from the Senate, where it's clear that chamber is focused on being bipartisan on spending bills and really asserting the power of the purse that Congress holds. And in both the funding bill that funds education, there was what passes for good news these days in terms of level funding for each of the specific programs that had been withheld, and a message to the agencies that those programs should continue to operate as separate programs, not be combined into a block grant that the White House had proposed earlier this year. So that was good news on that count. And then in the Commerce, Justice, Science bill, which is the bill that funds the National Science Foundation and other investments in research that we care about deeply, there was a distinct message from Senate appropriators that they still very much believe in the importance of STEM education at the National Science Foundation and would prefer the preservation of the STEM Education Directorate there, and their firm belief that there's value in broadening participation programs at that agency, and vocal support for continuing to invest in those efforts. And I think those positive developments are testaments to advocacy, not just from our community, but from the science community and from particular members of Congress who have been swayed by their constituents' stories about the importance of those investments in institutions of higher education, research efforts that are in their states and their communities.
Yeah, and I just wanted to add to that, and to what James was saying too, is that in terms of what to do and what not to do, right? Like, it's about always advocating to grow the pie, right? Like, it's not your thing at the expense of another thing. So even when the 21st Century funds were released, for example, we were very clear that we really wanted to see all the other funding released, right? Like, we celebrated the fact that 21st Century funds were released, but sort of said all the other title funds need to be released because families and parents and schools are depending on that. And so I think it's really, really important that when you do your advocacy, that you just do have that sort of big tent approach, as I know all advocacy organizations do, but it's just important to keep that in mind, that it's not just about you and the one program that you care about, but it's really about lifting all boats.
Thank you for joining us for this insightful discussion on the policy landscape affecting STEM education and workforce development. We hope you've gained valuable perspectives and actionable strategies from our conversations. We'll continue this important dialogue with critical insights about top STEM priorities and more guidance on navigating the current advocacy landscape. To learn more about the work of STEM Education Coalition, Afterschool STEM Hub, and STEM ecosystems, please visit our websites. Until next time, keep advocating for a strong STEM education and workforce nationwide.